Good afternoon, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session on my Rumination News Network channel. Thank you so much for joining, and we hope that you would like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, this afternoon, we are going to deal with two very important stories I should say, two very important stories coming out of the news this afternoon. Now, I understand that many of you think that we are not, under war efforts. We're not in war because, we talk about the Constitution and that, constitutionally, Congress is the body that the founding fathers authorized to declare war. And that is for sure. There's no doubt about that. That is not debatable. Okay, that is an equivocal and unequivocal fact. However, the United States in 2001, after 9/11, went into a never-ending war in which George W. Bush suggested that he was not going to end the war until the terrorists have all been, until they all disappear, until they have all been demolished. That was what he declared. So when we're saying that there is no war, it is partly true and partly not true. It is partly true that it is Congress which should declare war in the United States. So far, we haven't seen or heard Congress doing such. However, given the fact that since 9/11, a war on terrorism has been launched, it means, therefore, that until that war is finished, and that is what George W. Bush suggested, continued by Barack Hussein Obama, the first Trump administration, the Bidens, and we have Trump again, Trump 2.0, that war is still in earnest. That war is still in earnest. And they have now transported that war from Asia, from the Middle East, from Africa to the Caribbean and Latin American region. Very important that you understand that. So yes, partly there is no war because Congress legally, constitutionally has not declared any such war. However, I think that we are still under those war, resolutions, whatever you want to call it, those war powers that were enacted under the George W. Bush's administration, under George W. Bush administration. Remember now that the Patriot Act was passed, and we have to familiarize ourselves with the content therein of the Patriot Act. I find that the journalists in the United States are not talking about the act. They are talking about the Constitution, which they should speak about the Constitution in light of what they see is happening under Trump. I find the US media particularly hypocritical. It is only when Trump is in power, and we have Trump 2.0, when he was there, Trump 1.0, the same thing happened, where they remember the Constitution. When the Democrats are in power and they are running roughshod over the Constitution, nothing is said, or very few spatterings of any opposition you will see or you will witness. Under Trump, we're hearing about the founding fathers and what they did and what they didn't do, okay, and what the Constitution says and what the Constitution does not say. However, they are not speaking about the Patriot Act and how the Patriot Act supplanted the United States Constitution. So the media needs to awake that conversation, that people will understand that there is another law in the United States ratified, signed under George W. Bush, immediately after 9/11 took place, which is contending for the supremacy, which has, I would say, supplanted the US Constitution, or perhaps I should say more responsibly so, is supplanting because it has not totally supplanted yet. We are almost there, and that is why you're seeing different amendments to the Constitution being totally evaporated, being totally disappeared. Okay, and that is what we're seeing, we're witnessing with our own eyes right now. So if I were you, I would go and I would familiarize myself with the Patriot Act. I think you have 1, 2, and 3. You have to read those Patriot Acts, which were actually put into existence under George W. Bush rather, and they continued under Obama, under Trump 1.0, under Biden, and now under Trump 2.0. Very important that you do that, okay? Now, this morning, the antiwar.org opened up with a story. Trump says U.S. forces seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela in latest escalation. So the war efforts are escalating. President Trump said on Wednesday that U.S. forces have seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, marking the latest U.S. escalation in its push toward a regime change war aimed at ousting Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. As you probably know, we've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela, the president said during an event at the White House. A large tanker, very large, and he likes to use the word very, right? He's superlatives that he likes to use. That's Donald Trump. Largest one ever seized, actually, and other things are happening. And other things are happening. So for those of you who think that there's no war and Trump is just posturing, he's not serious. He's afraid of China. He's afraid of Russia. Okay? I would love that. I would love if Russia and China could ward him off so that they won't be any war, but we cannot allow our guard to be let down. At this juncture, we just cannot, because this war has been in the works for many years, for at least 2 decades and more, that Washington has been seeking to overthrow the Bolivarian Revolution that has been happening in Venezuela since 1999. Very important that we begin to understand that history, okay? So U.S. officials told CBS News that the seizure involved 10 members of the U.S. Coast Guard to 10 U.S. Marines and Special Operations Forces, and we heard that the Special Operations Forces are on the grounds. Other reports said that the tanker named the skipper departed Venezuela and was on its way to Cuba when it was boarded by U.S. forces. Now, remember we said that part of the war efforts, part of the agenda of the war in Venezuela is also to topple the government of Cuba and also, by extension, Nicaragua. So we are not very surprised here that the United States is already planning to probably stop, oil from being transported from Venezuela to Cuba so that they can suffocate that economy and people will rebel, and perhaps the United States will lead out in a complete revolution and overthrow the Cuban government. We're not suggesting that that is going to happen, but this is what we are seeing, the development of which we are seeing. And some critics have been suggesting that when the United States began to take over the airspace, as they were closing down the airspace, or, well, he commanded, they could not have done it. Obviously, planes are still coming, landing in Venezuela and leaving Venezuela. Okay? But it was Trump's, I'm sure, ambition, goal, call it whatever you want to call it, to also not allow any contact between Cuba and Venezuela. Because without Venezuela, we know that the Cubans, their economy would have been under the toilet. All right? Totally a failure at this juncture. Remember now that they don't have any other mode of assistance. And under Hugo Chavez and the former president of Cuba, that political leader, that is Fidel Castro, they had inked out, great relationship in which, Cubans would send doctors and medical personnel and other things, the resources to Venezuela, and Venezuela would sustain the economy, the Cuban economy, with their oil, among other things that they might be able to barter. Very important that we understand that. Now, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi released footage of the operation and claimed the tanker was used to transport sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran. She said the tanker had been sanctioned by the U.S. for multiple years. So the U.S. has that right to just sanction, even though it's not within her remit to do so. Okay? Just sanction a ship. You know, this is interesting. So who controls whom? If you can sanction a ship that is not even your shore, okay, but you can just sanction it because you have the power, or you think you have the power to do so. The U.S. seizure came less than a month after the U.S. military condemned Iran for seizing a tanker off its own coast that it claimed was smuggling fuel, an action that U.S. Central Command called illegal. Iran's use of military forces to conduct an armed boarding seizure of a commercial vessel in international waters constitutes a blatant violation of international law, undermining freedom of navigation and its free flow of commerce. We call on Iran to articulate to the international community the legal basis for its actions, CENTCOM said. Trump was asked what would happen to the oil, and he replied, well, we keep it, I guess. During the first Trump administration, the U.S. stole several shipments of Iranian gas that were bound for Venezuela and sold them. Now, if that is not stealing, I don't know what it is. You tell me. Iran and Venezuela's trade relationship grew at the time due to both countries facing crippling economic sanctions, and they began to trade gas for gold. So even when the United States imposes economic sanctions on countries and they're finding ways of, going around, right, that sanction, the United States extends its sanctions by even crippling trade between these two countries or among countries. Now, if that is not imperialism, I don't know what it is. If that is not imperial overstretch, I don't know what it is. And where is China and Russia? Where are China and Russia, I should have said? Okay, where are China and Russia to say, stop this? It cannot happen. It cannot happen because they have interests there too. Or are they just protecting their interests and they are not concerned about what will happen to Iran and perhaps other countries and Cuba? Okay? And these are the questions we have to ask ourselves. These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. China and Russia, at least, are members of the United Nations Security Council, right? And I haven't heard anything about such sanctions. Okay? Now, that is interesting, and we await their verbiage or whatever they have to say on the matter. Proponents of a regime change war have pointed to the country's vast oil resources as a reason to attack Venezuela. For those Americans who do not understand why we need to go in, Venezuela for the American oil companies will be a field day because it will be more than $1 trillion in economic activity. And that is coming from Maria Salazar, and she is a Republican or representative, I think. She said that last month, and she's out of Florida. The U.S. escalation against Venezuela came a day after the U.S. flew two Navy FA-18 fighter jets deep into the Gulf of Venezuela, which I reported yesterday, marking what appeared to be the closest U.S. fight to the country's coast since the major U.S. military buildup began in the Caribbean a few months ago. So the war efforts are escalating, and it's time for us now to pray and to seek the guidance of the Most High. Because let me say something. If these war efforts, I should say, get worse, If they worsen, we know that we're in trouble because there could be a full-fledged war among these great powers. And let me say something to you. They're not here to liberate us. We are the ones who will suffer. Mrs. Kamala Harris-Bessessor and Nicolas Maduro might not be hurt. Maybe they will be just taken out of their countries. While we will have to contend with the mess that they are going to leave us. Because you must understand that generally speaking, with few exceptions, of course, where leaders have been, unalived, right? But for the most part, they sometimes get away unscathed. All right? Look at what happened in Syria. And eventually the Assad regime was able to leave with the help of the Russians. So they get their people out and their economic and political interests out. They're not going to get you out. You will have to deal with the effects of war. Okay? You will have to deal with the effects of war. And people have been asking about radiation and even the equipment there, the radar equipment at the A&R Robinson International Airport in Tobago. People have been asking me, what about the effects of radiation? Okay? Is it emitting any form of radiation? I don't know. I'm sure that it does. Okay? I'm sure that it does. And we just have to be careful and to be alert and take the necessary precautions. And we might have to change our diet now so that we don't, make worsen our, chances of getting cancer and some of all of these other diseases that come with radiation. Women have to be particularly cautious, but men do. Okay, now we are looking at another story that is coming out of Politico, that US seizes Cuba bound. Well, that is what we discussed just now. We discussed that. But there's another story that that was very interesting that I wanted to share with you. That NYT, that's the New York Times, editorial boards urges US to prepare for war, future war with China. For future war, not war present, but for future war with China. So the New York Times editorial board released a video on Monday calling for the US to prepare for the future of war and urged the Pentagon to take drastic steps to be better prepared for a potential fight with China, a conflict that could quickly turn nuclear. So this is New York Times that is calling for a war or telling the United States to prepare itself for a war with China, a future war, it suggests here. And I quote, US politicians often boast that America has the strongest and most powerful military in the history of the world. But behind closed doors, they're being told a different story. The editorial board said, New York Times opinion has learned that the Pentagon has been delivering a classified, comprehensive overview of US military power called the Overmatch Brief. The report shows what could happen if a war were to break out between China and the United States. The results are alarming. The video said that a war with China might seem purely hypothetical, but claimed that Chinese President Xi Jinping ordered the Chinese military to be ready to seize the island of Taiwan by 2027. However, that timeline is based on claims from the CIA and has never been confirmed by Chinese officials. Xi reportedly told President Biden last year that there were no such plans to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. The Times editorial board said that defending Taiwan won't be easy and called on the US to invest more in new technologies such as drones rather than symbols of might, referring to large aircraft and warships. Now, isn't this confusing? We had in the Trump's document, the security document, that he was saying he was pivoting to China, that China should control, Asia and be autonomous in her sphere of influence, in her neck of the woods, while the United States would control the Western Hemisphere. Now, the United States is deciding that it's still, well, I shouldn't say is deciding because it has already decided and has not changed its mind A leopard cannot change its spots, and the United States is a leopard too. All right? It's a leopard. The fact of the matter is that if that is true, what the New York Times is suggesting, that paper on which, or the papers on which the national security document were published means absolutely nothing in terms of the US's credibility. The US has lost its moral credibility. Because if it is in fact suggesting that they're okay with controlling the Western Hemisphere and they will not seek to interfere in, to police the world. That's what they were saying. They will refrain from policing the world. Only the Western Hemisphere that they would like to police. But the other parts of the world, such as Asia and Africa, well, they didn't mention Africa. That was an interesting thing too, that they did not mention anything great. We didn't hear much about Africa in Trump's latest publication, his national security document. Nothing, really nothing about Africa. Now, what are their intentions for Africa on the continent of Africa? Very important that we ask these questions. Okay? So when we see now that the New York Times hypocritically, they pretend as if they are against Trump, but they are telling him to prepare himself for war. If the United States wants to defend Taiwan, now why would the United States want to defend Taiwan when Taiwan is a part of the Chinese landscape, territory? The United States was the one that divided them in the first place. Okay? Now, the fact of the matter is that we can't trust what the United States says. So obviously, it is still on a quest, and I told you, for full spectrum dominance. And even though it's suggesting that it's just going to consider, or it's going to just be concerned about the Western Hemisphere, that it's not so, that her eyes are still on every nook and cranny of the world, including Asia, Eurasia, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The United States of America want them all, want full control, desire full spectrum dominance. Okay, so when all of that document, maybe that is Trump's agenda, but still, the New York Times is saying, be prepared for 2027. And Trump is not going to leave office until 2028, all things being equal. Okay, so what are they suggesting here? What are they suggesting? It's crazy. What a crazy world. Now, the board suggested several steps for the US to take to prepare for war with China, including building new autonomous weapons and leading the world in controlling them. Leading the world, not just the Western Hemisphere, and relaxing rules on purchasing weapons to make bets on young companies. The video comes after Congress unveiled a $901 billion National Defense Authorization Act that, when added to a supplemental spending bill passed early this year, will bring the official US military budget to over $1 trillion. This is the New York Times that is suggesting, the paper that behaves or pretends that is anti-Trump, but is it? It's been nearly 10 years since the overmatch brief was first delivered. Its warnings have updated and delivered again to the new Trump administration. We've been warned about the urgent need for change. The question is whether we'll change in time, the video concluded. For years, the Pentagon has named China as the top pacing threat facing the US and has been openly preparing for war with China. Whether it's Trump, Biden, Obama, or George W. Bush, they all have been preparing for a war with China. President Trump's War Department is expected to prioritize the homeland and the Western Hemisphere in its coming national defense strategy. The homeland and the hemisphere. So the Western Hemisphere and the homeland. So the Western Hemisphere includes the Caribbean and Latin America. Very important that we understand that. as outlined by the recently released National Security Strategy, but it will still be putting a focus on a military buildup in the Asia-Pacific to get ready for a future clash with China. So it's not serious that it's only going to control the Western Hemisphere and the homeland. They're still planning strategically and covertly to control the entire world. Very important that you understand, while stressing that allies in the region should spend more on their military. So they're asking us, they're asking Europe to spend more on the military. I understand that we don't know. The Trinidadians have to question Kamala Person's predecessor about how much is she budgeting for Trump's military conquest against Venezuela, because some of the expenses the Trinidadians, perhaps CARICOM nations, will have to burden and saddle themselves with. Okay? So they're going to ask the region that is suffering. Many people are suffering. They don't have what to eat. They're not getting a livable wage. Many citizens of the Caribbean and Latin America are not getting livable wages, and they're barely surviving. Yet the United States desire that they saddle themselves with debt regarding war efforts, military, activities, military conquests that are not in the interest of these Caribbean and Latin American countries. But because the empire says so, they will have to be saddled with these debts. That is what we're seeing. That is what we're facing. So those of you who think that the Chinese are here and the Russians are here to free us, right? They're here to protect their interest, okay? Just like the Americans. The Americans are waging war to protect their interests, and not the interests of the citizens of the United States, but the interests of the domestic elites and the global elites with whom they are affiliated. Very important that you understand that. We are the ones who are going to be affected, while our leaders, for the most part, you'll have some sacrificial lambs here and there, because that's how they play the game. And then you'll be distracted if Kamala should fall and say, wow, and you've got justice. But guess what? If Kamala falls, that's not justice for us, because the agenda would have already been accomplished. And that is what we have to understand. So we have to now move away from personality attachment or detachment, and begin to detach ourselves from the system and try to understand how the system functions and operates. Because without that, we're going to find ourselves looking at the wrong person. And the persons that we should be really looking at are the ones that we're thinking are there to help us. Very important that you understand that. So I think I can end this video now, and I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe. On my Caribbean News Flash channel, I'm going live tomorrow, where we'll discuss more about this war on China and the fact of the United States stealing oil tank right there off the coast of Venezuela. That is incredible. And I think the international community should say no, because it's okay if you tell me I can't barter with you, I can't do economic trade with you. But when you block other countries from engaging in economic activities, who really controls the Caribbean and Latin American region? Are we really free? These are some of the questions that we have to ask ourselves. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe, and join me on Caribbean News Flash tomorrow for the live. So go onto that channel tomorrow, subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed, and let's go there. It begins at 12 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time tomorrow afternoon, 12 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. And please remember, we're live on Rumination News Network on Sunday at 4 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time with Patrick Wood. I will definitely confirm that with him today. Again, remind him that he will join us on Sunday, and tomorrow you'll join me and we'll talk more. Come and let's discuss because these are very, very important matters. Ciao.